Hello and welcome to Excel CA 121 with Heather Hines. I'm your course instructor. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 1, which is just a basic introduction on how to format worksheets and chart data. Some terminology that you're going to need to be familiar with is right here. You can download this file of Canvas. It's in the PowerPoint for Chapter 1. All right, so absolute references, active cells. What does all this mean? All right, so here are the formal definitions. Let's dive in and see what each of these means when we are looking at an actual worksheet. All right, so first thing, we have a worksheet. All right, here is the sheet. You can have multiple sheets within the same workbook. So the whole file is called a workbook. This is a sheet or a worksheet within that file. Kind of like a book, and then you have pages in a book. Very similar to that. An active cell is the one that has a little green surrounding it, so you know that that's the active cell. Each cell is named by the column and the rows. So the columns have letters, and the rows have numbers. So for example, I would call this C4, and that just makes it easy to identify which cell you are talking about. So cells, they have different names. All right, so we just talked about an active cell, which has that green border. Let's highlight that. And we also just talked about cell references. All right, cell references, you have the letter for the column and a number for the row. All right, so next, let's talk about ranges. So for example, if they say, hey, I want to merge and center this through this. How would I say that? Well, this is A1 through H1, but I'm not going to use the word through because, you know, that's just extra work. So I might say merge and center A1, use a colon to denote a range. So a range of cells, I use a colon. So when we have titles, it's very common that we just merge and center just to make it look nice. Next, we might want to format it. You know, it's a title, so we might make it larger, bold, make it in color. Or you can use, so you can format it yourself, whatever formatting you like, or you can use Excel's preset styles. So if you go to the Home tab, here we see the word styles, and you can change the style to maybe a title style. Okay, and there's a bunch of different preset styles. There we go. All right. So what did we just cover? We covered how to name a range. Next, let's talk about how to do autofill and create equations. All right, so right here, this says total cells. So obviously what they want us to do is to add up all the cells from these three different regions and figure out what are the total cells after calculating all three regions. So there's tons of ways you could do this. You could get out your handy calculator and add all three of these numbers up. And manually input the number. However, why do that? That's usually a no-no in Excel to just manually do it and put in a number. Why? Because what if we realize, hey, we made a mistake on this number and we need to change it? Then that number would be off, and so would this number. All right, so instead of manually, we're going to be using what's called relative cell references. We're going to reference different cells, okay? So a few different ways to figure out the total. In Excel, to total, the word is sum. So we would say equals, all equations start with equals, sum, parentheses, and then I would highlight the range of cells, and notice how they put the little colon to denote that it's all three of these cells, a range of cells, and then close the parentheses. All right, and so what that's doing is that's referencing these three. The other way to do this, and this is kind of a newer Excel feature, is to use the quick analysis, which is what I believe they want you to use for the grader. Let's talk about that real quick. You're going to open up the totals, and there's two sum features. One where you get the sum at the bottom, and one where you get the sum to the side. Here we want to sum up and down, so we're going to use this one, and it automatically makes it bold. And then we're going to use the fill handle feature. That's this at the bottom right hand side. The fill handle, what it does is it copies and pastes anything that's there. So in this case, it's saying, hey, I want you to copy and paste the equation, which is great. So be careful. For example, you don't want to use the fill handle here, right? Because this is a number, not an equation. And so if I copy and paste it through, then it copies and pastes the number all the way through. So be careful using the fill handle. So here we use the fill handle, and it copies and pastes the equation. Now this equation is, the default is always what you call a relative reference. So for example, let's click over here at the equation. It's saying it's summing C4 through C6. It's not summing B4 through B6 because Excel automatically assumes, hey, if you're copying and pasting it, you want to move a row over. So this is a row over, so the equation is the next row. So this is column D, I'm sorry. So we're going to sum column D, so on and so forth. So these are relative references. It's summing D4 through D6, and I'll show you in a little bit how to do an absolute reference. So we just talked about relative references and how to use the autofill feature. Next, let's talk about auto-calculating absolute cell references. In Excel, you do a few different things so frequently that they've created little buttons for you. So they've created sum, average. So these are just the quick, what were they called? Auto-calculate features that you have. And you also, again, we have them in this autofill option right here. Right. All right. So the other way to total is going across. We're going to use the quick analysis toolbar. Go to totals. Instead of summing up and down, we want to sum left to right. So we are going to use that one. And then we can again use our fill handle all the way down. Okay. Now, when would we use an absolute cell reference? Well, that is when we're using percent of total, right? So percent of total, how do you find the percent? To find the percent, it's always division. So percent, you divide what you're interested in by the total, right? So that's how to find percents. So we're going to say equals. We want to know what percent of this northeast, makes up the total cells. Okay. Now, technically, I don't need an absolute reference, but let's just say I want to use that equation all the way down, then yes, I do need an absolute reference. Why? Because what are we wanting to divide by in the next one? Let's click on it and see. Oh, it's dividing, but it shifted down to southeast, which is what I wanted. But then it also moved total cells to F8, which has nothing. So what do we want that to be? We want that to be F7. All right. So how do we lock that in and so that we can use that equation, the autofill? So we go back to the original equation and we say, hey, I want that F7 to be locked in, to be an absolute reference. So I'm going to highlight it and press the F4 button. And so put money signs in front of the F and the 7. And you can also, instead of pressing the F4 button, you could have put money signs. And what that does is it locks it in place. So those money signs say, hey, it's locked in place. So now I can pull that down. And all these should add up to 100%. Let's clean this up. Those don't look like percent, so I'm going to format it to look like a percent. And I can increase or decrease the number of decimals that show. All right, so let's look at our vocabulary. We just talked about absolute cell references and our auto-calculate buttons. Next, let's talk about spark lines. So spark lines are just little charts that show you visual trends. So let's just say, hey, I want to look at all 4 of these quarters and see is there any big fluctuation between those quarters. So I might say, hey, I want to insert, and so I'm going to highlight the data that I want to look at. Generally, when you're making a chart of any kind of visual representation, you either select the data points, those are the points inside, or the totals. You don't want to do all 5 of these because that would be ridiculous. So generally when you're graphing data, you want to do either the individual pieces of data inside or the totals, but not both. All right, so I'm going to highlight the 4 quarters. I'm going to go to Insert tab, and I'm going to click on this, which is a spark line. Now it's going to ask, hey, this is the data range that you want to graph. Where do you want it? And I'm going to say, hey, I want it right there. I'm just going to click on it. And then I'm going to press OK. And I can pull it down. It's using relative cell references. I didn't use absolute ones. And so I can see, okay, so, you know, it was relatively stable except for the 3rd quarter here. Here, the southeast region fluctuates quite a bit. And here in the west, it dipped in the 2nd quarter but went back up. Okay. So we just looked at spark lines. Lastly, let's look at how to select multiple ranges, what data points are, and how to chart data. All right, so say I want to make an actual chart of data. There's so many different charts I can make with this data, but let's just say, hey, I want to look at the different quarters and the different total sales for each quarter to analyze how was each quarter doing, how is my company doing for each quarter. So I might highlight the quarters, and I want to highlight the quarters, and I also want to highlight down here. So how do I do that? I highlight up here first. I then press my control button and then highlight down here. Okay, so again, I highlight this, done. And then I press my control button and highlight down here. And now I have 2 ranges highlighted. I'm going to go to Insert. I'm going to click a chart that I like. Okay, let's pick this one. And this chart has a few things that we need to know about. So let me zoom out just a little bit. All right, so first, each of these quarters, 1, 2, 3, 4, is a data point. So these are data points. So charts are made up of data points. Here we have 2 axes. We have the x-axis, which is now called the category axis, and the y-axis, which is called the value axis. So values are here, categories are here. So category axis, and then the value axis. Right. This chart has elements. We can change the chart title by simply double-clicking there, or we can observe all the chart elements by clicking this little plus expander thing and then going to what I want to change. The other way that I can look at chart elements is whenever I create a chart or graph, now I have an extra little tab up here. So now we have chart tools, which if I click off of the chart, I don't have that tab. But when I click onto that tab, I now have chart tools, okay? And I can take a look at the different chart elements and change them right there, okay? So typically you want to give it a descriptive title, like regional sales by quarter, or total sales by total sales by quarter for a company. And there we go. That is how to create a simple chart. Remember, each chart is created from data points. These are our individual data points. We can select multiple ranges by pressing the control button. This is called our category axis, and this is called our value axis. We have now covered all of the Chapter 1 terminology, so now it's time for you to work on the Chapter 1 grader.